There is an official government report filed in 1863 that almost nobody talks about today. It wasn't written by a treasure hunter or someone trying to sell an extraordinary theory. It was prepared by government geologist Charles Whittlesey after years of surveying the copper country around Lake Superior. His job was simple: document what American mining companies were finding as they opened new mines across Michigan's Upper Peninsula. What they expected to discover was untouched copper. What they actually found was something completely different. Long before the first American mining companies arrived, someone had already been there. Not once, not at a single location, but across an entire region that thousands of ancient mine pits, underground workings, stone hammers, timber supports, and evidence of a mining operation so extensive that even the engineers who first documented it struggled to explain who had built it or where the enormous quantity of missing copper had gone. More than 30 years later, in 1894, a researcher recorded something equally remarkable. Ojibwe elders spoke of strangers who had crossed the Great Water, came only for the copper, worked the mines for generations, and then disappeared. Was it simply an oral tradition, or could it help explain one of North America's oldest archaeological mysteries? To answer that, we have to begin where the evidence begins, not with legends, but with the ancient mines that were already waiting beneath the forests of Lake Superior. When American mining companies entered Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the 1840s, they believed they were opening one of the last great untouched mineral frontiers in North America. Geological surveys had confirmed that the region surrounding Lake Superior contained some of the richest deposits of native copper ever discovered. Unlike most copper around the world, which had to be smelted from, or much of the copper here existed in its pure metallic form. Prospectors imagined enormous profits waiting beneath the forests, and investors poured money into what quickly became one of the fastest-growing mining districts in the country. But it didn't take long for the excitement to give way to confusion. As engineers began clearing land and opening new shafts, they repeatedly encountered signs that they were not the first people to mine these deposits. Across the Keweenaw Peninsula and the islands of northern Lake Superior, they found ancient excavation pits scattered across the landscape. Some were shallow depressions almost hidden beneath centuries of forest growth. Others descended dozens of feet into the ground, their walls cut with surprising precision. In many places, massive trees had grown directly inside abandoned mine pits, their roots wrapping around broken rock that had clearly been disturbed long before the forest reached maturity. This was not what anyone had expected to find. The more ground they surveyed, the more these ancient workings appeared. They weren't isolated discoveries made by a single mining company. Different crews working miles apart and often with no connection to one another reported remarkably similar features. There were trenches following exposed copper veins, carefully cut drainage channels designed to keep water from flooding the excavations, and piles of waste rock stacked in ways that suggested organized mining rather than casual collection. Then came the tools. Hundreds of stone hammers began appearing at sites throughout the region. Most were made from extremely hard volcanic rock, shaped to fit comfortably in the hand and worn smooth from repeated use. Some weighed only a few pounds, while others were so heavy they would have required tremendous effort to swing. Archaeologists would eventually recover thousands of these hammer stones, many still lying exactly where ancient miners had left them beside exposed copper deposits. To 19th-century engineers, their presence raised an obvious question. If these mines had been worked with stone tools, who possessed the knowledge and organization to carry out an operation on this scale? The evidence suggested far more than occasional visits to collect surface copper. It pointed toward generations of experienced miners who understood the rock beneath their feet. In several locations, investigators found clear signs of a technique now known as fire setting. Before explosives existed, miners would build large fires directly against a rock face, heating the stone for hours before rapidly cooling it with water. The sudden change in temperature fractured the rock, making it possible to remove large masses of native copper with surprisingly simple tools. It was an effective method, but not one discovered by accident. Fire setting required planning, experience, and an understanding of how different types of stone responded to heat. It represented knowledge passed down over many generations. Knowledge shared by ancient mining music cultures in Europe, the Near East, and, as the evidence suggested, the shores of Lake Superior as well. Then decades later, archaeologists began dating the wooden remains preserved inside several of these ancient workings. The results transformed an unusual mining story into one of North America's greatest archaeological mysteries. Some of the timber recovered from the old shafts was approximately 3,000 years old. Other samples proved even older, long before the Roman Empire, long before the Vikings crossed the Atlantic, and in some cases old enough to place these mining operations thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans in North America. By this point, there was no longer any serious doubt that the mines themselves were ancient. The real mystery had become something much larger. If people have been extracting copper from Lake Superior on this scale for thousands of years, where did it all go? By the time Charles Whittlesey completed his federal survey in the 1860s, one fact had become impossible to ignore. The ancient mines were not small. After years of studying the old workings across the Lake Superior region, Whittlesey estimated that ancient miners had removed between 1.5 and 2 billion pounds of native copper. Modern archaeologists debate that figure, arguing it may be too high, but even the most conservative estimates still suggest that hundreds of millions of pounds were extracted over thousands of years. Either way, the scale is extraordinary. To appreciate what that means, consider what archaeologists have actually found across North America. Copper artifacts certainly exist. Beautiful ceremonial objects, tools, fishhooks, spear points, awls, and ornaments have been uncovered from sites stretching from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi Valley. They prove that copper was widely used and traded by indigenous cultures long before Europeans arrived. But there is a problem. The total amount of copper recovered from all of those archaeological sites represents only a tiny fraction of what appears to have been removed from the Lake Superior mines. The numbers simply don't match. If hundreds of millions of pounds of copper were extracted, where is the rest? Was it melted down and reused over countless generations? Did it disappear through trade networks that archaeologists have not yet fully reconstructed? Or was a significant portion carried somewhere far beyond the Great Lakes? That last question has fascinated researchers for more than a century. Because solving it doesn't just require explaining the missing copper, it requires explaining who had the knowledge, organization, and transportation needed to move such enormous quantities of metal in the first place. And that is where the mystery begins to leave the mines and move onto the water. Once researchers accepted that the ancient mines were real, a second question became much harder to avoid. If enormous quantities of copper were removed from the Lake Superior region, how was it transported? Moving a few hundred pounds is one thing. Moving hundreds of millions of pounds over centuries is something entirely different. Lake Superior is not a small inland lake. It is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, capable of producing storms powerful enough to sink modern ships. Anyone transporting large quantities of copper would have needed more than simple canoes or temporary rafts. They would have required organized logistics, experienced crews, and vessels capable of carrying heavy cargo across open water again and again. That question becomes even more interesting when you look across the Atlantic. During the European Bronze Age, civilizations produced enormous quantities of bronze for tools, weapons, ceremonial objects, and trade. Bronze is made primarily from copper and tin, and for decades archaeologists have debated whether Europe's known copper sources were sufficient to meet that demand. While Europe certainly had productive mines, some researchers argue that the scale of Bronze Age metal production raises questions that are still being studied today. In recent decades, scientists introduced another tool into the discussion: isotopic analysis. Because copper forms under different geological conditions, deposits from different regions can sometimes carry distinct chemical signatures. Researchers have used these signatures to compare ancient copper artifacts with known mining areas around the world. Some studies have suggested similarities between certain artifacts and copper from the Lake Superior region, while others disagree with those interpretations and argue that the evidence is not yet conclusive. The debate continues and no broad academic consensus has been reached. But regardless of where that discussion ultimately leads, one fact remains unchanged. The ancient mines around Lake Superior existed, the copper was extracted, and a remarkable amount of it has never been accounted for. Then, more than 30 years after Charles Whittlesey filed his federal report, Another piece of the puzzle appeared, not from a geologist or a mining engineer, but from the oral history of the people whose ancestors had lived beside those ancient mines for generations. In 1894, a researcher sat down with the Ojibwe elders and carefully recorded what they remembered about the people who came for the copper. In 1894, the Wisconsin Historical Society published a collection of Ojibwe traditions recorded from elders whose families had lived around Lake Superior for countless generations. Among those accounts was one that has attracted growing attention from researchers interested in the ancient copper mines. The elders did not describe discovering the mines themselves. They spoke about the people who worked for them. According to the account, strangers arrived from the east crossing the Great Water in large vessels. They were remembered as organized groups who seemed to know exactly where the copper could be found. They did not wander through the forest searching for deposits. They traveled directly to the mining areas, extracted the copper, and returned to the water with it. Whether every detail reflects a literal historical event or generations of oral tradition is something historians continue to debate. What makes the account remarkable is how closely several descriptions align with archaeological evidence that had already been documented independently. The Ojibwe described fires being built against exposed rock to break it apart before the copper was removed. Long before those traditions were recorded, archaeologists had already identified evidence of fire setting inside many of the ancient mine workings. Burned rock surfaces, ash deposits, and fracture patterns all pointed to the same mining technique. The traditions also describe copper being moved from the mines towards the shoreline where it was loaded onto waiting vessels. Today, archaeologists know that many of the largest prehistoric mining sites are located only a short distance from the shores of Lake Superior and Isle Royale. While that alone does not prove where the copper ultimately traveled, it does show that transporting heavy material by water would have been the most practical route available. Perhaps the most intriguing part of the Ojibwe account is how it ends. There is no great battle, no catastrophe, no story of the miners suddenly disappearing overnight. Instead, the elders simply recall that after many years the strangers finished their work, loaded the last of the copper onto their vessels, and departed across the water in the same direction from which they had come. Then the lake became quiet again. For generations that memory survived through oral tradition before finally being written down in 1894. By itself, the testimony does not answer every question surrounding the ancient mines. But when it is placed beside the archaeological evidence, the thousands of mine pits, the stone hammers, the fire setting, and the immense quantity of copper that was extracted, it becomes one more piece of a puzzle that historians and archaeologists are still trying to understand. And more than a century after those words were first recorded, the central mystery remains exactly the same. More than a century and a half has passed since Charles Whittlesey walked the shores of Lake Superior documenting what American mining companies were uncovering beneath the forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. During that time, technology has transformed archaeology. Excavations have become more precise. Radiocarbon dating has allowed researchers to determine the age of ancient wooden mine supports with remarkable accuracy. Geological analysis has revealed how the copper formed millions of years before humans ever arrived. Every generation has brought better tools and new methods for studying the past. Yet, despite all of that progress, the central mystery remains surprisingly unchanged. No one questions that the ancient mines exist. Thousands of prehistoric excavation pits have been documented across the Keweenaw Peninsula and on Isle Royale. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of hammer stones shaped from hard volcanic rock, many still lying beside exposed copper veins where they were last used. Burned rock surfaces and layers of charcoal continue to provide evidence that ancient miners used fire setting to fracture solid stone long before explosives existed. The archaeological evidence for large-scale prehistoric copper mining is not controversial. It has been studied for generations and continues to be investigated today. The unanswered questions begin only after that point. Who organized such an enormous mining operation? How was knowledge of techniques like fire setting developed and passed from one generation to the next? How many people worked these mines over the centuries? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, what became of the copper? Even if the highest 19th century estimates are reduced significantly, the scale of extraction remains extraordinary. It represents an amount of metal that would have required planning, labor, transportation, and organization over a very long period of time. Whatever happened at Lake Superior was not the work of a handful of individuals collecting surface nuggets. It was a sustained mining industry unlike anything most people imagine when they think about prehistoric North America. This is why the 1894 Ojibwe account continues to attract attention. Not because it proves every theory that has been proposed, it doesn't. Oral traditions preserve memories across generations, but like all historical sources, they must be considered alongside archaeology, geology, and the broader historical record. What makes the account remarkable is that it describes people who came specifically for copper, knew where to find it, used methods that resemble those identified by archaeologists, and eventually departed across the water after their work was finished. Whether those details preserve an exact historical memory or a tradition shaped over centuries is something historians continue to explore. And that is where the story becomes so fascinating. The archaeological record preserves the mines. The 19th century surveys preserve the observations of the first modern engineers who examined them. The Ojibwe preserved a memory of the people they believed had worked them. Each source tells part of the story. None tells all of it. History is rarely solved by a single discovery. Instead, it is assembled piece by piece, document by document, excavation by excavation. Sometimes a forgotten government report changes the way we look at an old landscape. Sometimes an archaeological excavation confirms what earlier generations only suspected. And sometimes an oral tradition survives long enough to raise questions that modern research is only beginning to ask. Perhaps future excavations around Lake Superior will uncover new evidence that reshape what we know about these ancient mines. Perhaps advances in archaeological science will answer questions that have remained unresolved for more than a century. Or perhaps some parts of the story have already disappeared forever, leaving only fragments scattered across old reports, museum collections, and memories that were carefully recorded before they were lost. Whatever the final answer may be, one fact stands beyond dispute. Long before the first American mining companies reached the shores of Lake Superior, long before Charles Whittlesey filed his federal report, and long before the 1894 Ojibwe account was written down, someone was mining copper here on a remarkable scale. Who those miners were, how their operation was organized, and where so much of that copper ultimately went, remain among the most intriguing questions in North American archaeology. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through original records, archaeology, and historical evidence, consider subscribing for more. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Who do you believe the Ojibwe were remembering when they spoke of the strangers who came for the copper? And what do you think became of the metal they carried away?